All right, it is now 9:20, so let us begin our check-in and sharing how, at least briefly, how things went in your particular groups. And again, we'll just do that for about 5 minutes or so, because I've got a particularly lengthy and meaty talk to give today, and I want to make sure to have enough time both to share all of the thoughts that I've developed with you about regarding your neighbor as a person, and then also leave time for Q&A while still respecting our general in and out in an hour kind of thing, which we have yet to exactly master, but I keep shooting for that. So I want to ask Tanner to start off by telling us, who joined him for Zoom and what the discussion was like there. Tanner.
We are coming, and we got everything up and running. You are being recorded and watched by people online. So,
oh dear,
yay for us. So we were Candace and Candy and Margaret joined us, and they were. She had a very interesting observation. How they noted. First, apologize. She didn't specifically work on two good things and one bad thing. But one bad thing she noticed was, she first called it boredom. That there were, because especially since the pandemic, things have gotten very much homebound and ritualized and rigorized, and she was starting to feel a boredom. And I said, well, that's funny, because Christopher in his opening was talking about how one of the ways to identify evil is a kind of dull, ignorant repetition. It's just what sounds like you're talking. She was like, exactly. She was like, so we just decided to go out one night. And she said it changed everything. She's just going out that one night.
Yeah.
Changed everything. So me, myself, I tried to be cleaner and didn't do so well. I live alone, so it's like I don't have anyone. I don't have anyone to blame but myself if my apartment gets dirty. But making the resolution to try to be better in cleaning unveiled deeper levels of dysfunction that I have a little bit of what an old teacher called tramp, which is just the inability to value things, especially. Especially like your surroundings and your impressions and stuff like that. So anyway, fruitful stuff happened this week, although we didn't exactly do the 3 steps.
Close enough. I mean, you're identifying things in the playing field of good and evil habits. So what are some of the things that emerged in some of the other discussion groups?
Yes,
Alexis.
I did the opposite. I'm a neat freak.
Which can be its own weird obsession.
It was a weird obsession, and so what I did was I'm decluttering and preparing for taxes, and so instead I just pulled everything out and made a big huge mess. Huge mess. And Jorge was walking through there and he said, oh no. Yeah, I can't do this at all. And I loved it. It was so great. It was so great. And I just relished in it. I relished in it.
All right, freedom. Thank you. What are some other things that came out with the good habits and the bad habits? Anyone else want to share a thought or what happened? Yes, Judy.
About as a bad habit is being a drive-by judgment, doing drive-by judgments, that you drive by someone you've never met, you've never seen before, but you've decided who they are, what they're thinking, and you know exactly what's wrong with them and how they should be fixed.
I don't know what you're talking about, Judy.
I saw a lot of heads nodding around here. But some of the good habits were learning to pray, learning to appreciate the silence, saying thank you, help recognizing people who don't get recognized, who typically aren't recognized, and helping people who are in distress. That a lot of times people in distress get walked by. You walk past them really fast because you don't want to get caught up in their distress, but making a real effort to do that.
Yeah, that last one really sounds exactly what Simone Weil was saying in the first class. That's a deep human habit. Anybody else want the mic? share a thought or two? Well, it sounds like rich conversation, and definitely within the, yeah. Were you raised?
Well, sure. We had some conversation. I'll speak about it. So, the habits that we gave up were spending time on social media and reading the Wall Street Journal from cover to cover, and having a glass of wine after work. So these habits, giving up those habits, made room for things that were more life-giving and fruitful. Whether it was, time for creativity, creative pursuits, there was more a desire for creative pursuits, and just more time for doing things like reading of more inspirational or more interesting or creative things, and then walking outside in nature was a habit that we wanted to increase also.
Terrific. Thank you. Good. These all sound exactly like what I was aiming for in last week's talk about good habits and bad habits. Part of what I think is important to recognize is that good and evil is not some abstract thing that's happening somewhere else, that it really is like woven into the texture of our moment-by-moment existence. And focusing on habits is a way of understanding that in every moment we carry good and evil in us and the capacity for both. And this is an ancient wisdom. Discernment of spirits is what it's called. And the ancient practice, in the East they call it nepsis, which is watchfulness. And that spiritually maturing is to become more watchful. And this is exactly what we are to be watchful of, the good and the evil. All right, Mike, are we on like the YouTube thing already? That's recorded? Ah, okay. Well, welcome, those of you on YouTube, to the 5th of 6 sessions of Transcending Contempt. And the format has been that I do a 20 to 25 minute teaching each week that concludes with a practice to take into that week. And then we begin again the following week with a little check-in about how that practice went. And then I introduce a new one. So today is the 5th and final practice. We have one more session where I will be, we'll be doing this kind of 3-person check-in. I'm going to have about 15 to 20 minutes of concluding remarks. And then we're going to spend some time figuring out what's next for each of us. How can we carry these practices forward so that we are strong, we are beacons of light and love in this election year, and have begun to truly transcend contempt in our own lives. That's the goal for each of us. So this is the 5th and final practice, and I am calling it Regard Your Neighbor as a Person, person all in capital letters. What we've done so far, if you look at page 2 in your packet, you'll see we started off with practicing WAG, wonder, attention, and gratitude. We moved to nurturing magnanimity, stewarding your halo, and then loving ourselves, and then I've written afterwards 3 habits, so we remember that loving ourselves isn't an abstraction, it's actually a practice. So the 5th one is loving our neighbors, is how you fill that in, and then person, all in capital letters. That will be the Christian practice. But before we get to that practice, we're going to get there through receiving prophetic challenge from 2 black thinkers. From James Baldwin, we're going to get the challenge of, for many of us, can we move from being people who are trapped to people who are free? And from Christina Sharp, we're going to get the challenge of, can we move from being people who perhaps are complicit to people that are creatively entangled. Both of these shifts, the challenge that comes from James Baldwin, trapped to free, the challenge that comes from Sharp, from complicit to creatively entangled, both of us are ways to help us regard our neighbor as a person. The words this week are false human hierarchy, surd, trapped, repair, and person. Two things first. One, I keep coming back to this notion of Thomas's cosmos and his idea of the great chain of being, that there's God, the angels, human beings, animals, plants, inanimate objects, atoms, pure matter. Why do I keep coming back to that? Because I believe that a strong sense of a cosmic hierarchy is the foundation for a strong statement in keeping with the Declaration of Independence that all human beings are created equal at the exact same level of the cosmic hierarchy, created in the image and likeness of God. If that's the case, that means that all human hierarchies are at root false. They are likely to be creatures created by human beings, creatures of what Kierkegaard called the monstrous abstraction, the public, where everyone has opinions and no one owns them. They are creatures, these false human hierarchy, of human expressions of power, and frequently human expressions of power without love, the false human hierarchies. But the fact that there are these false human hierarchies and they do not reflect the profound truth that we were all made in the image and likeness of God, we were each made in the image and likeness of God, doesn't mean that they don't have real-world consequences. So the fact that they're false doesn't mean that they don't have real-world implications for how we live our day-to-day lives. In the summer of 2020, after George Floyd's death, the Harvard Business School did something it had never done before. The Harvard Business School teaches with a method called case study, where people pull together these 10 to 15 page summaries of some issue, usually dealing with some corporation or something like that, and gives them to the students and says, okay, here's the dilemma. How would you address this? Well, they did something they'd never done before after George Floyd and created a case study about being black in America, where in 10 to 15 pages they'd pulled together material that I'd seen before but in lots of different sources and put it into one, filled with statistics and numbers, and showed the discrepancy between whites and blacks on a whole range of different ways to evaluate. So income, generational wealth transfer, home ownership, longevity, incarceration, education levels, and so on. Across the board, there was a profound discrepancy between those who check the box white on those surveys and those who check the box black or African American. It is undeniable that we live our daily American lives in a false human hierarchy of race. And I would suggest even further that one of the main agitators of contempt in 2024 is race. Now, I've been framing this as a personal challenge. If you are likely to go into the voting booth in the fall and vote for Joe Biden, keep testing in your heart whether you have contempt towards those who are MAGA. And if you are likely to go in and vote for Donald Trump in the fall, keep testing your heart about how you feel about people who are woke. Both woke and MAGA are underwritten by American understanding of race. Right? So let's go into race a little bit more. If we believe in our core that creation is an ongoing gift from a benevolent God, and that each human being is created equally in the image and likeness of God, what do? We inheritors of this dangerous notion of race. I got some help last year thanks to Anne Carpenter and her book, Nothing Gained is Eternal. Carpenter is a Roman Catholic theologian who taught at St. Mary's in the East Bay and is now at St. Louis. In this book, she takes 4 of her favorite European Roman Catholic theologians and pairs them with 4 great black thinkers, one of whom is actually a great Roman Catholic theologian in her own right, Sean Copeland. So she engages the two. And at the beginning, she says something I find really persuasive. She claims that race, as we experience in America, is a surd. Like absurd, surd. A surd is a thing that's irrational. It does not make sense. So if you start trying to define what race is and try to wrestle a definition into the ground, you can't do it by its very nature. And I think that's a really helpful way to approach this. Again, it's this thing that has real-world implications, but that isn't rational. And if you look back to the origin of what we understand as race, that it comes in the 1400s as part of Portuguese colonialism, you know that right from the very beginning it's this human expression of power and doesn't have any kind of ontological basis. And a lot of the things that we want to say that are true, that people come from different geographies, different cultures, different languages, we can say all those things still. But the concept of race at the end of the day covers up more than it reveals. And I believe that to be the case. It is absurd, but with real-world implications. Carpenter takes her very favorite theologian, Hans Urs von Balthasar, and harrows him. That's the word that she uses, harrows, as in like gives him a really intense trial through perhaps the most powerful, or one of the most powerful black thinkers, James Baldwin. So I am going to invite us to go through the same thing with a series of quotes from James Baldwin in just a minute. But first of all, I want to introduce you to James Baldwin. James Baldwin is born in 1924 in Harlem, dies in 1987 in France. He's born in 1924 in Harlem, which is where he grows up. And in World War II, he moves downtown to Greenwich Village, where he does 3 things. First, he starts writing. Second of all, he starts hanging out with really cool artsy people. Marlon Brando becomes a close friend, for example. And then third, within his artsy circle, he comes out of the closet as a gay man. In 1948, he decides that he can no longer live in America as a black man and as a gay man. He needs to go someplace where who he is can be honored more. So he moves to Paris. And starting in 1948, his writing takes on a next level. So he publishes a hugely respected novel, still respected to this day, Go Tell It on the Mountain. A great short story, Sonny's Blues, that makes compilations of best American short stories. And he writes a collection of essays, Notes of a Native Son, one of the best collections of essays of all time. And he continues to hang out with really cool people. He gets to know Jean-Paul Sartre, Truman Capote, on and on and on. 1957, he decides to come back to America, largely to participate in the civil rights movement. And he was very much a part of that. He was up on the podium in August of 1963 when Martin Luther King gives his I Have a Dream speech. He's up on the podium, but he's not asked to speak. Why? Because he's gay. 1970, he moves back to France, this time going to a small village outside of Nice. And he continues to write, continues to be influential, and his little house becomes a place where all kinds of cool people go and stay and hang out. So he's host for Ray Charles, Miles Davis, Sidney Poitier, Harry Belafonte, Nina Simone. He's a real sort of center of cultural vitality. A hugely interesting man. He dies of stomach cancer in 1987. Please turn to page 3 in your packet, and I want to walk you through some of what James Baldwin has to say about race in America. So first two quotes about black and white. He writes, "In America, the color of my skin has stood between myself and me." And the question of color, especially in this country, operates to hide the graver questions of the self. Now, I find this particularly challenging, and I believe it to be true. Why do I believe it to be true? Because I have followed for years a practice of Christian contemplative prayer. And one of the things that one is taught in the tradition of Christian contemplative prayer is that in contemplation, what gradually happens is that we see finally that a lot of what we present to the world is a false self. And contemplative prayer is the practice of letting go of false selves. And I can easily imagine that the color of our skin, that box that we check, is among our false selves that we are called to let go of. And that can be a lifetime's work, regardless of what box we're checking in those surveys. Next, whiteness. Whites are trapped in a history they do not understand. Trapped. So I picked up that word from trapped to free. Trapped. He writes a letter to his nephew in the early 60s. "We cannot be free until they," meaning white people, "are free. You must accept them," and I mean this very seriously. You must accept them and accept them with love. That last word is why I trust him to be an uncomfortable prophet for me. Love is a huge theme for James Baldwin. Now, he grew up Christian, Pentecostal Christian, and he let that go after his adolescence. So he's secular as far as I know. But love he never lets go of. And all of his difficult, hard truths he proclaims in a spirit of love and an invitation into love. And then he writes that in order to face a life like Billie Holiday, the American white has got to accept the fact that what he thinks he is not. He's got to give up. He's got to surrender his image of himself. And apparently this is the last thing white Americans are willing to do. So that's us, me, as white. I will remind you that Billie Holiday's most famous song is Strange Fruit. You ever heard that song? Do you remember what the strange fruit is in that song? It's black men who have been lynched. There's a discomfort, an invitation, and also a challenge in a life like Billie Holiday for those of us who are white. What is our role? What is our participation in that reality? What must we surrender in order to have a more generous and true sense of how things have unfolded in our American history? It's an uncomfortable challenge. Carpenter, as she mentions these quotes and others, and one of these I included myself, she writes, "Color hides the reality and authority of the human subject misnamed black. I wonder," this is what I'm writing, "color binds the reality and freedom of the human subject misnamed white." So last week I asked you to start thinking about race, your thoughts, 6 words, and I shared with you that I had a hard time coming up with 6. It was relatively easy to come up with 7, but I've landed on 6, and here's my 6 words that I'm living with as my personal challenge. May I shed my label white? And here's what's interesting to me about that question. May I shed, so I'm asking somebody something. May I shed my label white? Who am I asking? Who has the authority to say, yes, Christopher, you can shed your label white? Me? God? Other people who check the box white? Other people who are my friends who do not check? It seems like there's a lot of permission giving that needs to happen, and I'm not entirely sure who has that authority. So it's an interesting question for me to live with. So, James Baldwin, From Trapped to Free. Here's Christina Sharp. Christina Sharp, her challenge is from complicit to creatively entangled. Christina Sharp is a professor of Black Studies at York University in Toronto, the largest university in Canada. She was at Tufts for many years. She published a book called Ordinary Notes last year that made a lot of lists of the top books of 2023. I referred to her and quoted her in the first session. You may remember the story of the woman who goes to the museum in London and notices the person and says hello, and the black woman doesn't respond and tells her that nobody has said anything to her in the months that she's worked there, and she says, "I see you, yes, we see each other." So that's Christina Sharp. Christina Sharp and I share several things in common and a couple of very important things not in common. Here's what she and I share in common. She and I are both Gen Xers who grew up going to the King of Prussia Mall. She grew up in Wayne, Pennsylvania. I grew up in Hockessin, Delaware. We grew up in the same place, and the place that we grew up in is reflected in her book, Ordinary Notes. I'm like, oh, I know that place. Oh, I see that. She includes pictures and things. So that. She and I both went to Ivy League universities for both undergraduate and graduate school in the 80s and 90s. So as she's writing, I'm like, oh, I know where she got that idea. Oh, I've been in that conversation before. So I get that. I get her in that way. And then the third thing is we both share powerful maternal figures who taught us about beauty. Christina Sharp's mother appears again and again in Ordinary Notes, and particularly her house, her elegance, the way she dressed, the way she posed. I had a grandmother who I called Button, who served the same role for me. And I can tell as I'm reading the book that she and I both have a deep reverence for the power of beauty. For me, I was a philosophy major as an undergraduate, and one of my primary focuses was aesthetics. So truth, beauty, goodness. Those are the big three philosophical obsessions. And mine was beauty and how it connected to truth and goodness. And Christina Sharp operates the same way. So I get her. She really speaks to me in a deep way. Two profound differences. Christina Sharp is and grew up as a black, lesbian, working class, barely. I'm a white, straight man who grew up surrounded by affluence. That makes a profound difference. Secondly, Christina Sharp in no place references the power of God or of Jesus Christ. And I am a Christian. And I think that makes a profound difference also, as we'll see when we loop around. But despite that, she is, like James Baldwin, to me, a prophet. Let's take a look at her words, which are on page 4 of your packet. So the quote I want to unpack is, she writes in her book, "Regard is a habit of care. It is appreciation and esteem. It is the right of repair." So I think right off the bat of regard is a way of paying attention. It's another word for paying attention. It means paying attention specifically to human beings. And so I think of Simone Weil's quote that I shared with you in the first class about the importance of attention, and attention to our neighbor being the capacity to be with our neighbor and to think, or either think or say out loud, what are you going through? And it's something like that that Christina Sharp is pointing us to. Let's look more specifically. She writes about regard, "We black people are constituted through and by continual vulnerability to overwhelming force, though not only known to ourselves and each other by that force. The other knowing, that other note, is one that we might call regard." So that other note is like the, I see you, yes, we see each other. And it is in contrast to what she calls force. Now, I'm convinced that when she uses force, well, because we were formed in the same kind of way, that she's referring to Simone Weil. And on the next page of the packet, don't go there now, is a bunch of quotes of Simone Weil on force, which I think has a huge explanatory power. I commend it to you in this week. We don't have enough time to look at it, but so you can see what she means when she's contrasting force to regard. Next, my mother made joy. She worked hard at it. Those other parts of her life about which I know next to nothing, I have tried to enter with grace and imagine with tenderness, or I have left them alone. I owe my mother that. Regard. That's what regard is. And I ask you to note the tone of reverence in the way that she's talking about her mother and the way she's talking about what it means to regard another human being. It is to regard another human being with something like reverence. So regard. Regard is a habit of care. What's care? Her friend, Bonnie Honig. To cultivate care is to cultivate anticipation of another world and to live now dedicated to the task of turning this world into a better one. Well, I would suggest that that is like our definition of hope. Do you remember that I shared with you that I thought hope was like love, wonder, attention, and gratitude? Why is it like gratitude? Because I defined hope, and I'm not the only one who does this, as labor toward a gift. Labor toward a gift. And I think that's very close to Bonnie Honig's definition here. Labor toward a gift. Care. And then Sharp writes, care is complicated, gendered, misused. It is often mobilized to enact violence, not assuage it. Yet I cannot surrender it. I want acts and accounts of care as distributed risk, as mass refusals of unbearable life, as total rejection of the dead future. Care is distributed risk. So the risk of living in a false human hierarchy that includes race is not evenly distributed. So I wonder if working towards distributed risk, care, might mean taking on risk so that our brother or sister does not have to bear the same amount of risk that he or she is bearing at the moment. What might that look like? Finally, repair. First of all, she says what repair is not. She writes, spectacle is not repair. Spectacle is the right to capture what is deemed abjection. Well, what's spectacle? Spectacle is looking over and over and over and over again at George Floyd saying, I can't breathe. That's not repair. That's getting caught up in drama. That doesn't actually help, right, at the end of the day. But she takes it even further and talks about the experience of going into the National African American Museum or the new museum that the Equal Justice Initiative has done in Montgomery. And even those experiences of museum can also be spectacle that don't necessarily call forth in us acts of real repair, of care, of real regard of other human beings. So to be aware of, is this actually repair or is it merely spectacle that I am participating in? She gives us a counterexample, Katrina Brown, who is the director of a movie, Traces of the Trade. Have any of you seen Traces of the Trade or know about it? Movie that came out about 10 years ago, and Katrina Brown, who, by the way, is Episcopalian. As an adult, she had always thought, growing up in Rhode Island, she had always thought that the story of slavery had nothing to do with her. But then she started digging into her family history in Rhode Island, and it turns out that her family wealth from the 1700s and early 1800s came from shipping, and what was part of what they were shipping was slaves. And so she starts to dive into that and creates a movie about the trade having traces even in this like northern Yankee family, and starts to discover the ways in which American wealth is intertwined with slavery. And Christina Sharp writes, her desire to make things right propelled her movement from personal guilt, which may be a position of distance, a position of non-implication, but may also be one of complicity, from personal guilt to grief, a position of relation, one of entanglement. So I draw out of that the words complicity and then put entanglement and add our word creativity. Remember the teaching last week was that good habits are ones that are creative habits. So what would it look like to move from a place in this false human hierarchy that includes race, from a place of complicity to a place of creative, intentional entanglement? Is a question, is a challenge to me. Now, what I want to make clear is that I am sharing with my wrestling and engaging with both Baldwin and Sharp, I am sharing with you my cutting edge, where I have questions and not immediate or easy answers. But I invite you to wrestle with these things with us. So Baldwin, from trap to free, Sharp, from complicity to creative entanglement. Now let's turn to a perspective that may help us, which is this week's Christian practice, and that is regarding people as a person. Now, Baldwin and Sharp to me are like Moses, leading me out of Egypt and across the wilderness to the promised land. But if you know the story, Moses dies on a hill right before crossing the Jordan. He does not get to the promised land. We need Joshua, Yeshua, Jesus to help us get from one place to the other. As St. John Chrysostom said, it is not enough to leave Egypt. One must also enter the promised land. And one of my teachers, Martin Laird, wrote, if we are going to speak of what a human being is, we have not said enough until we speak of God. So let us speak of God, and here's the practice. When you look at a human face, imagine that you are looking at a person, all capital letters, P-E-R-S-O-N. Why? All in capital letters. Well, in my translation of the Bible that I use most often, the NRSV, you frequently see the word Lord all in capital letters. Why? Well, God revealed God's name to Moses in the burning bush. I am who I am, I will be who I will be, which got condensed into JHWH. Some translations of the Bible then have Yahweh or Jehovah every time JHWH appears. My Bible has all capital letters Lord. Why? It's following the Jewish practice of revering the name of God, not saying it out loud as a way of reverencing the Holy One. So what I'm suggesting, if you think of human beings all in capital letters as a person, that is a way of revering them as made in the image and likeness of God. Now further, two more fancy words. You can begin to think of them as theotropic enigmas. Theotropic enigmas. All right, so first of all, theotropic, you've probably never heard that word before, very rarely used. It is an actual word. You have to Google really hard to find it. But it is there. And here's what it means. Sunflowers are heliotropic. Why? Because God made them to tilt towards the maximum amount of sun, which is why when you drive by a field of sunflowers, they're all tilted in the exact same direction. We human beings, made in the image and likeness of God, were made theotropic. We were made to tilt towards God as the source of our life. We were also made with free will, and none of us tilts always in the right direction. If you were to drive by a field of planted human beings, our faces would be all over the place. And at the same time, it is true that God made us to be tilted towards God. And that is true of each human being that you encounter, no matter how wretched, no matter how sinful, no matter how wicked. They were created by God to tilt towards God. Theotropic, enigma. Enigma is to contrast with the word cipher. This seemed true to me when I read a review of a movie coming out with Scarlett Johansson. If there's a movie with Scarlett Johansson, I will tend to go and see it. I love Scarlett Johansson. But I read this review, and it said in this movie she's a Russian spy. And the review said, at the end, you aren't given very much about her background or her motivations. And rather than coming off as an enigma, like a whole human mysterious person, she comes off as a cipher. somebody that you just project whatever you want to, and it never feels like it actually is a real person that's there. So theotropic enigma is a way to say that each human being is mysterious to us. We cannot know that other person fully. It's a way of practicing. Remember again that in the first session we talked about WAG, practicing wonder, attention, gratitude. Well, it's a way of being in wonder of each human being that we encounter. A person who is a theotropic enigma as a Christian practice, grounding us in the truth that we believe that each human being was created in the image and likeness of God. Following in Jesus' footsteps, this means that we regard people as persons who are both higher than us in the false human hierarchy and lower than us in the false human hierarchy. Remember, Jesus famously teaches in Mark 25, "Surely as you did it to one of the least of these, you did it to me." And he's referring to people who are hungry, who are in prison, who are strangers, who are sick. And he also, in Mark 10, has this remarkable encounter with a rich young ruler, higher than him on the social hierarchy, who comes and asks him how he can be saved. Jesus tells him, "What are you doing now?" He tells him the 10 Commandments. And then Mark, and only Mark, says that Jesus looking at him, loved him, and then tells him what he needs to do. So Jesus loves up and down the social hierarchy. Doesn't matter. We are called to do the same thing. Now, one last word. You don't need to do it now, but if you turn to the last page on your packet, there's a little piece of wisdom from the Desert Fathers, huge source of contemplative wisdom, but Christian wisdom, period, where one Desert Father asks for a word from the other, and the Desert Father says, "If you want to find rest here and hereafter, say in every occasion, 'Who am I?' and do not judge anyone." Next week's questions are then, 1, what are your 6 words about race? 2, who were the people you held with regard this week? Looking at them as a person, theotropic enigma. What happened? And then 3rd, it's our last session, we'll conclude with what will you do next to help yourself transcend contempt? And I'll say that if you're willing to stay afterwards, I'm going to offer a suggestion. If you're willing to stay afterwards for a little bit of time, we can have a conversation about creating a structure to help us continue having this conversation and practicing these practices. So, I want to turn it to you all for questions and comments, but first, I want to ask, and I warned her, so I'm not just putting her on the spot cruelly. Judy, I want you to share with folks your experience of trying to regard people as persons, as theotropic enigmas, and what that was like.
This happened probably 4 or 5 summers ago. Christopher had done this teaching, and I'm blessed enough to be able to go up to Orcas Island regularly. It's on the San Juan Islands, and it's this absolutely gorgeous island, and my brother-in-law keeps his boat up there all summer. And when we're up there, we're out on the water all the time, crabbing and fishing. And it's very quiet. And we have a few friends on the island, and it's very quiet. And it was very easy to think about this practice and to look at people in the face and really regard who they were. And I did that for several days, and it was very, very opening to actually stop thinking about myself and think about somebody else. And we went back to my sister and brother-in-law's house, and they live in nowhere where there's nobody. And they took me to SeaTac Airport. And if you've been to that airport, you know, you go through TSA, and then you walk out into this huge room. And I walked out into this huge room into all these people trying to look at all their faces. And I thought my head was going to explode. And I had to walk to my gate with my head down because there was no way I could process all those people. Absolutely no way.
Yeah.
So this is a very powerful practice, but you kind of have to be careful.
Pace yourself. Good. Thanks, Judy. All right. I just gave you a lot of content. I know that. I don't know if I shared this at the beginning. It sort of surprised me that it unfolded in this way, but it felt like it had to me. So yes, Pat.
I found this session very disturbing in that I might look at this a very different way than you do, but in a broader sense. I think we have a tremendous breakdown of community in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Not only in the United States, in the world, in San Rafael or wherever. And we have a breakdown of values. We have a westward migration of the world falling apart. So we have these forces that are emerging that I think are far beyond racism. Racism, I think, or the differences in people are in all of us, and our ability to get along with each other is something we have yet to figure out.
Yeah.
But to say that the basis of all of this is our ability to regard one another as equal and individuals and people of merit, it does not ring true with me. And if you look at it in a historical sense, you can go from the church to the state to the community to the church and watch these values disappear.
Yeah.
And the more diverse we get in mixing of people and income levels and the hierarchy that was in the past to organizing ourselves in a maybe a political sense. I think that to put the root of our differences or our inability to get along, essentially, if you think of Rodney King being beaten up on the highway, and what did he say? Why can't we all just get along?
Yeah.
But to view this in terms of to say that MAGA Republicans are at the bottom of this, the difference between MAGA Republicans and everybody else, maybe I'm misinterpreting what you're saying, but I cannot see that I would not apply that racism in a very broad sense to that. I would say values, I would say individual education, geography, and I would say order. The desire to keep the order as it is today and not move forward.
Well, first of all, thank you all for listening to me as I take this material out in a very dense way for the first time. So I'm trotting this out, and some things are going to land and some things won't. One response to one strand of what you're saying is that I don't mean to imply that race is the only way. I just think it's a particularly powerful way that runs through our lives. You just named a whole bunch of other factors that are profoundly important as well. I just view it in my own life as something that I'm continually trying to get over, and I hear that echoed in the culture as well. So you are right to label other ways we can be attentive to how we are separated as human beings. And I didn't mean to suggest that it's only race, nor do I mean to suggest that it's just MAGA folks who are wrestling in a sometimes not helpful way with race. I think the same thing's true of woke. It's a symmetrical failure, I believe, on both sides. And I wonder if as Christians we can bring something to this conversation that transcends the ways that we're talking about it very clearly, unproductively right now. So, but I don't mean to imply that this is the only. I just mean to imply that this is one of them that's still very live for us, that hasn't kind of gone away. Yes, Bill.
Yeah, the reason why this program really appealed to me, and I believe you and feel you, was because politics isn't serving us now.
Yeah.
And that's for I think maybe our loss of wisdom. And we've had these common touchstones and common perspectives that have held us together to this point. But I think that if we are to survive or continue, this is exactly what has to be done. I like words a lot, and they're like gems when I get a good one, and this one is a gem, theocentric. Therein lies hope and faith.
Tropic.
Tropic, thank you.
Yeah, tropic, meaning it's tilted towards.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And that's I appreciate that a lot. And I think it's that kind of attention to what we are in essence, that if it can be incorporated socially, we may well have a chance to get through this. But at this point, what's being used, and I just really, I say this only to help us out of this thicket, but if we think in terms of race, I really think that that's following a con job that was conjured up a couple centuries ago.
Yeah.
So I think we need to think in terms of ethnicity, culture, heritage.
Yeah.
I think that gets us more to being able to deal and massage and work with these problems. I think to think in terms of race, which is 1/10 of 1% different at the most,
Yeah.
genetically,
Right.
it doesn't work. It's used as a way to get.
Yeah. No, I'm with you, and yet I can't shake it. It's still so much in our cultural blood. Yes, Chris.
It may be a false thing, but it's such a huge, such a defining thing that, yeah, it might be phony, but that doesn't mean it isn't real.
Yeah.
And it is in terms of the way we think of things. And I think that the idea of not regarding people as individuals and seeing through, I mean, that's the basis of everything. That's at the root of all the problems, the root of the values, whatever else you want to talk about. If we could really regard each other the way we should, when we're talking about it, I think the other things wouldn't be much of an issue. And I think we can pretend race doesn't exist, but it's there. It's a huge, huge thing, and we have to think in terms of it if we're going to deal with the problem.
I just think it's illusory. I think it's been a con job, and I think we have to stop thinking.
So I imagine.
It's such a good
So
concept.
I'm going to ask Alexis what her thought is, and then I want to conclude because I'm not doing a very good job at honor our time together, and say a couple final words as I send us out in the coming week. So Alexis.
James Baldwin said, "I didn't know if I was black until I was in the United States." In other words, when he went to France, he was a person.
Yeah.
And I grew up in Texas, and I had this whole false hierarchy deal going on. And I didn't know I was a person until I went to school at Hunter College in New York City. And I realized I was a person. I wasn't involved in this white and black thing that's going on.
Yeah. Thank you. And I knew I was taking us into an uncomfortable place. And I don't claim to have all the solutions here. I just claim to be asking questions that are uncomfortable for me right now. As I told you, this is my own cutting edge. And I invite you to wrestle with these this week and come back next week, stay in the conversation. Know I believe James Baldwin when he talks about doing this in love. And I believe Christina Sharp when she talks about striving for this greater beauty. And the only thing I want to add is Jesus, that Jesus can show us a way through this uncomfortable place. I believe that. So I invite you to go into this week and 6 words, or race your thoughts, 6 words. And let me remind you that part of what Michelle Norris discovered when she did the race card project was how hungry we actually are as Americans to talk about this. There's this sense like, oh, we're going to get too angry and it's all going to break down. But the 6 words reveal that there's a lot of tenderness and openness on the part of individual people to explore. So hopefully we're creating a safe enough space to do that. So that, regard, and then think about what happens not this coming Saturday, but the Saturday after that, when we're no longer meeting every week. How can we continue to do this deep work of transcending contempt and be people of light and love going into this election year? Thank you all for keeping on coming back. Hope to see you all next week for the 6th and final session of Transcending Contempt.
Grace.